Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at scrolls and books in our continuing study of how we got our Bible. In the ancient world, the common writing surface throughout the Middle East was the tablet, the clay tablet. Clay worked nicely because you could harden it, you could write on it, and then once it hardened, it wouldn't easily be changed. Of course, there wouldn't be anything in the way of erasers. But then a new invention came about, and it came about, as you would imagine, from Egypt. Along the Nile River, especially before it empties into the Mediterranean, is the region known as the Delta. And this is a marshy, reedy area, and the reeds that grow up there are known as papyri. The papyrus plant would be taken. It would be taken and cut into strips, both vertical and horizontal, and one group laid over the other, and then the worker would take a rock or smooth surface and pound this together so that the sap would cause it to congeal, and then it would be set out in the sun to sort of bake for a week or so, and the result was a writing surface. So that we have papyri. This was much more portable than our old clay tablets, and you could either stack them or you could sew the pages together into a long scroll. And now you could actually have what the Phoenicians called, and later on the word came to be picked up by the Greeks, a biblos, that is a book. Now, a book could be either, bound on the side, or it could be a scroll. Originally, it was a scroll. And because this invention had come about in Egypt, you have early in Egypt one of the first libraries that is actually holding not just clay tablets, but now scrolls made of papyri, the Library of Alexandria. The city of Alexandria, of course, had been founded by Alexander the Great, and then in the several hundred years after that founding, the library grew to epic proportions and became the most famous library in the world. And yet it was not without its eventual competition, both at Rhodes and Athens, but especially I want to talk about the library at Pergamum, because the library at Pergamum was growing to a point where it was going to be competing with the library of Alexandria. And the folks at Alexandria, I'm not sure that they wanted to have the competition, and so they put an embargo on papyri. Suddenly in Pergamum they couldn't get any new papyri. And so what were they to do? They came up with an alternate solution to papyri. And the alternate solution was using animal skin. And so we have two words we need to get used to. One is parchment, and one is vellum. Let's start with parchment. They're both animal skin. Parchment is animal skin, can be a sheep or goats or calves, and calves are possibly the best source, but these others will do. These tend to be a bit rough in quality, especially the sheep and the goats, even though they would scrape off all of the hair. Hopefully they got it all off. It would tend to be a bit rough. The word vellum is actually a French term, and it was originally used to describe only calf skin. Although it has come to be used in a more general sense of any good quality parchment. And so now it's used of any sort of fiber, but as opposed to parchment, it tends to be a little bit lighter quality and refined. And so you have parchment and vellum. They're essentially the same thing, but vellum is just a better sort of parchment. Now these would be the papyri had been bound together in the scroll, and likewise vellum could be as well, but now you had a new format that could more readily be used and was adopted around the time of the first century, especially by the Christians. And this was the codex, where now the pages would be bound on one side so that you could, just like we do with a book, we can turn the pages, and this made it very easy to go from one. In other words, you just didn't have to roll the same roll, beginning at one end of the book and going to the other. You could actually say, wait a minute, I want to go back to the beginning of the book and look at something, and then come back to where I left off. And you can cross-reference going back and forth in a codex that wasn't easily done with a scroll. One other term we're going to see, I want to introduce us to now, is the palimpsest. It comes from the Greek word palimpsetes. It literally means scraped again. And parchment and vellum, I guess you could probably do this with papyri, but I can't think of any times where it has been done. Parchment and vellum, as well as papyri, were very expensive. After all, to get 2 pages, I have to kill one animal. One animal for 2 pages, and on each side I'm going to take the skin and scrape it off and prepare it. So there's the cost of the animal and the cost of preparation, and there's a great cost involved in using parchment and vellum. And if a book were no longer being used, perhaps the ink had started to fade, or it was, we would say going out of print, then the ink could be scraped off and the sheet could be reused. And this happened time and time again because of the high cost of parchment and vellum. And yet some of that ink residue would remain. And there have been cases where we have found a book that was under in other words, the old writing and then the new writing, and the old writing in certain cases have been found to be biblical text. And so because the trace amounts of the old ink remain, these can be painstakingly recovered, and in one case we've found a biblical text going back possibly as early as the 3rd or 4th century. A palimpsest, therefore, or we can call it by the Latin term a rescriptus, and we're going to be getting to know at least 1 or 2 rescripti. I'm not sure if that's a right word, maybe I just made that up. But this rescriptus, we're going to see that it is going to help us to recover some of the biblical texts.